Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're doing what we do best, getting right into the core of a really important piece of science. We're looking at predicting biological invasions, a huge challenge, especially with, everything changing so fast. We've gone through the sources you sent, and we're focusing on one key paper. It's titled Different Facets of the Same Niche, Integrating Citizen Science and Scientific Survey Data to Predict Biological Invasion Risk Under Multiple Global Change Drivers. Lead author is Mirko de Febbraro.
Yeah, and it tackles this fascinating central question about invasive alien species, IAS we often call them. What happens when you take data from professional scientists, these structured surveys, or SS data, and you combine it with, well, all the occurrence data the public sends in via citizen science, or CS? How does mixing them actually change our predictions about future spread?
And this isn't just, an academic exercise. Predicting where these invaders might go is critical. It feeds directly into that big global goal of reducing the impact of IAS on biodiversity. That's a major target in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And the tools we use for that, these ecological niche models or ENMs, they're only as good as the data we feed them. Get the data wrong or incomplete.
And your priorities could be way off.
Exactly. And that's where you hit the typical problems with each data type. Think about citizen science data, the CS stuff. It's amazing. In some ways, there's so much of it, covers huge areas. It's cheap to gather through platforms like iNaturalist. Loads of records, and it's a big but, it tends to suffer from pretty significant sampling bias. People report things they see near where they live, or hike, or visit easily accessible places.
Right, and you rarely get solid proof that a species isn't somewhere, the absence records. That's a key point.
Yeah.
Then you look at the scientific surveys, the SS data. It's rigorous, it's standardized. You can generally trust it more, perhaps. But it's often really small scale, limited areas, maybe only certain times a year.
And that limited scope, that's the problem they call niche truncation, right?
That's it, niche truncation. Basically, the survey area is just too constrained. It doesn't capture the full spectrum of environments, this species' actual ecological niche where it could potentially survive and thrive. So if your data only shows it living in, say, nice mild conditions now, your model has no way of knowing if it could actually handle much hotter or drier conditions in the future. It truncates the possibilities.
Okay, right. Let's unpack this a bit more. So the core idea, the hope in this study, is that by integrating the massive but maybe biased CS data with the reliable but potentially truncated SS data, you could fix that truncation, get a more complete picture of the species' potential, and therefore better future predictions.
Precisely. They wanted to see if you could genuinely get the best of both worlds, sort of patch the weaknesses of one with the strengths of the other. So they set up two very clear hypotheses they tested, using 13 invasive species in Italy. First, just pooling the CS and SS data together would always result in a net gain. You'd always capture a bigger slice of the environmental niche overall.
Okay, bigger niche captured. Makes sense.
And the second hypothesis ties it directly to risk. They figured that this gain in niche coverage would systematically lead to a higher predicted risk of invasion under future global change scenarios.
Ah, so a wider niche equals higher future risk prediction. If it can live in more places, it's potentially more dangerous down the line.
That was the idea. If the integrated model sees a broader tolerance, it should predict a wider, potentially riskier spread in the future.
Okay, that logic tracks. So how did they actually go about testing this? What was the setup?
Well, they focused on 13 species known to be highly invasive in Italy. They picked a mix, 6 freshwater species and 7 terrestrial ones. And they looked at them at 2 different scales. A big picture, national scale covering all of Italy, and then zoomed in for a regional analysis in the Piedmont area.
And the analysis itself sounds like it needed some pretty sophisticated modeling.
Oh, definitely. They had a 2-pronged approach, really. First, they had to figure out how different the environments captured by CS and SS data actually were. For that, they used Principal Component Analysis, PCA. It's basically a statistical way to boil down lots of environmental variables like temperature, rainfall, elevation, into fewer dimensions so you can visualize the environmental space a species occupies.
So you can sort of map out the conditions. Like, imagine plotting temperature on one axis, distance to roads on another. PCA helps you see the cloud of points from citizen science versus the cloud from scientific surveys.
Exactly that. And they quantified the overlap between those clouds using something called Schooner's D-index. It just gives you a number for how similar the niches are. Then, crucially, they used random forest models, a type of machine learning, to pinpoint which specific environmental variables were most important in distinguishing the parts of the niche that didn't overlap. Where was CS data showing something unique, and where was SS data showing something unique?
Okay, so that nails down the differences in the current data. Then they move to the future predictions.
Yes, using ecological niche models, the E&Ms, they use what's called ensemble forecasting, running multiple model types and averaging them to predict suitable habitat both currently and way out to the year 2100.
And they didn't hold back on the future scenarios, did they?
No, they really went for the worst-case plausible futures. They combined multiple drivers of global change all at once. For climate, they used RCP 8.5. That's a high-emission scenario, lots of warming. For land use change, they used the scenario called A1B, which involves significant changes.
And population.
For human population change, they used SSP5. That scenario involves rapid fossil fuel-driven development and considerable population growth and sprawl.
Hold on, just so we're clear for the listener. RCP 8.5 and SSP5 together. That's modeling a future with really significant warming and maximum sort of human expansion and development pressure.
That's right. Maximum plausible stress, you could say.
Yeah.
Pushing the models to consider conditions potentially quite far from what we see today. And that's vital because it really tests which environmental factors become limiting in the future.
Okay, got it. So what specific environmental factors did they actually feed into these models, especially when comparing the CS and SS niches?
At the regional level, they used 21 different predictors. It was a real mix. You had your standard bioclimatic variables, temperature, precipitation patterns, and topography, like elevation, slope, how rugged the terrain was. But really importantly, they included the human footprint quite explicitly. Things like distance to farmland, distance to urban areas, distance to roads, and even local human population density itself.
Makes sense. You can't really predict invasive spread without considering human activity.
Absolutely not. Especially for these species, their futures are often tied directly to our activities.
All right, so after all that complex modeling, what did the niche overlap tests actually find? Were the environments seen by citizens and scientists totally different or mostly the same?
Well, interestingly, for 10 out of the 13 species, there was statistically significant similarity in the overall niche space they captured. So broadly speaking, they were often found in similar types of environments.
There's always a but, isn't there?
But yeah, even with that overall similarity, the analysis dug deeper and found moderate to large regions of the niche that didn't overlap. They were definitely complementary, capturing different facets, as the title suggests.
So same broad church, different pews, maybe. Occupying similar overall environmental zones, but the specific locations or conditions within that zone differed based on who was doing the looking.
That's a good way to put it. And when they used those random forest models to see what environmental factors define those unique, non-overlapping bits, the picture became really clear. The environments that were exclusively captured by citizen science data, they were strongly associated with areas that had higher human population density. They were closer to human-modified landscapes, cities, roads, farms, and, interestingly, often linked with higher average temperatures.
And the flip side, the scientific survey exclusive zones.
Those tended to be in environments characterized by higher topography, steeper slopes, higher elevations, and critically greater distance from those human-modified areas, more remote spots.
So this really does confirm that whole accessibility biases idea, doesn't it? Volunteers, citizens tend to survey lowland areas near roads, near towns.
While the structured scientific surveys were better at capturing those perhaps harder to reach, more natural or high-altitude environments.
But the interesting thing here is framing that bias. It's not just a flaw. The citizen science data, because of that bias towards human areas,
Ends up being a massive database of exactly the kinds of human-influenced environments where global change impacts, like warming, population growth, habitat alteration, are often most pronounced. It's biased towards the future pressure points, in a way.
That's a fascinating perspective. Okay, so let's connect back to the hypotheses. What happened when they actually pooled the CS and SS data? Did they get that predicted net gain in niche coverage?
They did for most species. For 9 out of the 13, the pooled niche, the combined picture, was definitely wider, covered more environmental ground than either the CS niche alone or the SS niche alone.
So integration worked. It did mitigate that niche truncation problem for the majority.
It seemed to, yes. And here's a really key finding. The contribution from citizen science data was often the most significant factor in that widening. CS data provided the biggest gain in new environmental space captured by the pooled models. This was especially true for the terrestrial species when they modeled them at the national scale for Italy. We're talking a median gain of nearly 19%, mostly thanks to adding the CS data.
Wow, okay, so CS data wasn't just adding volume, it was adding genuinely new environmental dimensions to the picture, filling in those gaps.
It really was, particularly for those land-based species across the country.
All right, so the first hypothesis holds up for most species. Pooling leads to a wider niche, largely thanks to CS data. Now for the crucial second hypothesis. Did that wider niche translate into predicting a higher future invasion risk?
Yes. Emphatically yes, for the terrestrial species. For those 7 land species modeled nationally, the niche gain that came mainly from adding the citizen science data resulted in a significantly higher predicted future invasion risk.
Compared to models using only SS or only CS data.
Exactly. Capturing that broader environmental tolerance, especially in those human-adjacent, often warmer areas flagged by CS data, made the future forecast look quite a bit more severe, more risky.
Okay, but I remember reading there was a twist, something unexpected, particularly with the aquatic species. They didn't follow this pattern, did they?
No, they didn't. And this is where the study highlights the complexity, the nuance. They called it a double-faced role for integration. For a few of the aquatic species, especially when modeled at that smaller regional scale, pooling the data actually led to a net loss or shrinkage of the predicted niche compared to the niche captured by the scientific surveys alone.
Wait, how does pooling data make the niche smaller? That seems counterintuitive. You're adding more data
That
points.
does seem odd, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The paper suggests that at that finer regional scale, the process of combining the data sets, maybe trying to reconcile inconsistencies or areas with sparse data from one source, effectively ended up pruning away some environmental space. And specifically, the environments that got lost in this process were ones captured only by the scientific surveys, particularly environments associated with high temperatures and low precipitation. The extremes.
Ah, so the SS data captured tolerance to hot, dry conditions, but maybe the much larger volume of CS data, which perhaps didn't show the species in those exact extremes as often, somehow diluted or masked that signal when pooled?
That seems to be the interpretation. And the consequence was significant. When they ran the future predictions using these shrunken pooled niches for those specific aquatic species, the models predicted a lower future biological invasion risk than the models based only on the original scientific survey data.
Wow. Okay, that's a really important caveat then, because losing that information about tolerance to extreme heat and dryness, that could make the species look less resilient to future climate change than it actually is.
Precisely. It artificially reduced the predicted risk by effectively ignoring some of the harshest conditions this species might actually be able to tolerate, conditions captured only by the targeted scientific surveys.
So the takeaway isn't just pool all the data always. It depends on the species, the scale, and maybe how you pool it, ensuring you don't lose those critical extreme data points.
Exactly. It's a cautionary tale within the broader positive finding. And it leads to another interesting point they made about model performance. They found no significant difference in the standard accuracy metrics, things like AUC or the continuous Boyce index that measure how well a model fits the current data between models run on CS, SS, or the pooled data.
Right, so pooling didn't necessarily make the models better in a technical accuracy sense for predicting current distribution.
Correct. The models are all reasonably accurate at fitting the data they were given. But the implications for the future, the actual range prediction, changed dramatically depending on the data used.
So it wasn't about improving fit, it was about improving the realism of the future forecast by capturing a wider, more complete niche.
That's the core finding. The most robust result was that getting a wider niche reducing that truncation was significantly linked to predicting an increase in future invasion risk. And that link was strongest when the niche gain came from adding the citizen science data, with its focus on human-dominated warmer environments.
It paints such a clear picture of the complementary roles then. The scientific survey data is vital for capturing maybe baseline ecological ranges, remote areas, higher elevations.
Environments that are ecologically important, for sure, but perhaps less directly tied to the drivers of future change, like intense warming near cities or massive human population shifts.
Whereas the citizen science data, even with its inherent biases towards accessibility.
That very bias means it excels at capturing the environments, low elevation, near humans, across a wider thermal range sometimes that are right at the heart of where future global change pressures will be most intense. The bias becomes the signal for future risk.
So wrapping up the study's main message then, is it fair to say the recommendation is embrace citizen science data, especially for large-scale monitoring?
I think so, yes.
The overall conclusion is that CS data is incredibly valuable, a really pervasive contribution for tracking and predicting the future spread of alien species, particularly when you're working at national or broader scales. Don't discard it because of bias. Understand the bias. But the caveat stands. You need caution. The study clearly warns against just blindly throwing CS data in everything, especially for species the public might not easily identify or report accurately, or in very specific local contexts. That's where you might run into issues like that aquatic species example, where pooling potentially obscured crucial information and led to dangerously optimistic lower-risk predictions.
Right, context is everything. Which leads us to a final thought, something for you, the listener, to maybe mull over. Consider that aquatic species case again. Losing those warmer, drier environments from the scientific surveys and the pooled data led to a lower predicted future risk. Now think about futures like RCP 8.5, where extreme heat and drought become more common. What does this specific failure in pooling tell us about the true tolerance limits of invasive species, the ones maybe hidden at the margins of our current datasets? If our methods for combining data accidentally smooth over or miss these extreme tolerances captured by focus surveys, how much might we be underestimating the sheer resilience, the potential destructive power of these invaders as they face the really harsh climatic conditions the next century might throw at them?